Hi, today we're looking at dependency injection, and the example I'm going to walk through is using a .NET Core Web API, but the principles can be applied to any programming language. At a high level, dependency injection is all about providing an object with the various pieces of functionality it needs to do its job, rather than embedding all of those pieces of functionality in the object itself. We'll look at why this is a sensible approach, but first let's take a look at an example. The Web API example we have here is very simple. It's got one controller, the recipes controller, and it will serve up recipe information from the database. The controller has two public methods. One of them, getRecipes, which will return all recipes from the database. The second will return a particular recipe formatted as a string. The getRecipes calls the getRecipes from database, which creates an instance of the recipe database, and then it calls the getRecipes method on that and returns the resultant list. The getFormatted recipe gets the recipes from the database, matches the recipe on the ID that's supplied, and then calls the formatRecipe method, which is down here, and that builds up a string of HTML using the recipe information and returns that. So it's a very, very simple controller. Less than 60 lines of code, in fact, but there's still quite a lot wrong with it. Issues we have are, firstly, the underlying controller functionality is just not reusable. If, for example, I wanted to embed the recipe formatting logic into another client application and I didn't want to invoke it over HTTP, well, I couldn't do that without initializing an instance of the controller, and all I want is the formatRecipe method. Secondly, this controller can't be easily unit tested. We can't, for example, mock out the database when testing. So if this recipe database object here actually makes a connection to a SQL server, well then I need a SQL server in place for me to unit test the controller. The third issue is that the controller is very tightly coupled to both the database and also to the format being output. So this controller in its current state can only output the HTML format. If I wanted to change the format, then I have to come in and change the controller. I can't easily make this controller output in a different format or a range of formats. Similarly, if I want to change the database provider, so I want to move away from the SQL database provider, for example, then I'd have to come into this controller and any other controllers that are using that database and make changes, when all I'm really changing is the underlying database calls. So we've not separated our components very well at all. The fourth issue is that the controller should really just be a facade that kind of presents the underlying functionality via its HTTP methods. It shouldn't really be concerned with how the functionality is implemented. So again, about the separation of concerns. What is this controller object actually meant to be doing? And all it's meant to be doing is making functionality available over HTTP. So, how do we resolve these issues in our controller? Well, spoiler alert, we inject its dependencies. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The first step I take is to pull out all of the underlying functionality, the business logic if you like, into a separate component and create a kind of service layer. This should leave the controller to its single responsibility of serving up functionality over HTTP. So let's do that first. So I'll create an interface for the service first of all, and we will call it the iRecipes service. Now we already know the methods that this service needs to implement because we've currently got them in the controller. So I'll simply pull out these method signatures and pop them in the interface. I need to import the namespace, and that's our interface. So that's what the service needs to implement for the controller to use it. I'll create a concrete implementation of that interface here in the services component, and I'll call that recipes service. The recipes service needs to implement iRecipes service, and we'll do that like that. So it's got its two methods there. And what else do we need? So now we need to populate this class, and we've got all of the underlying logic that we need in the controller already. So let's just pull everything out of the controller and put it into the service. Here we go. So this is get formatted recipe, and then we do the same for get recipes. Okay, it looks like we need to import some namespaces here, so let's quickly do that. Yep. And again, and I think we're looking good. Okay, so we've basically moved the entire controller now into this service, but hopefully you get the point. So now from the controller, well, we need to call the service. So the first thing we need is an instance of the service. So I'll create a constructor for the controller, and that will accept an iRecipes service instance. And I'll create a read-only field here to store that in. iRecipes service. And I'll just set that in the constructor. Okay. Notice that we're passing in an instance of an object that implements iRecipes service. We're not passing in the concrete recipes service, because again there we'd be tightly coupling the recipes controller with the recipes service implementation. Okay, by passing in just the interface, it means we could change this implementation outside of the controller and just pass something else in to do the job. Okay, final thing we need to do at this stage is to call the service to make the controller actually do something. So we'll call get recipes, and then in here we'll call get formatted recipe, and we'll pass through the recipe ID. Now, what are we missing? I need to return the values. So let's just add the returns in. Okay, so what we've got here now is the controller has exactly the same functionality as it had before, but there's a lot less code in the controller, and the service that's actually doing the work is now passed in. It's injected via the constructor. So that's part one of this. We've now, the controller is doing the one job that it needs to do, and that's providing the functionality over HTTP and nothing more. And all we really need to do now is just repeat that process until we've got a set of components where each component is doing one job. So what we've done so far is just moved all of the functionality out into a service. So we've solved one problem in that we've simplified the controller, but we've really moved the other problems, such as the tight coupling to the database and the formatter. Okay, so taking each one of those in turn, we will start with the format recipe. So we need to move this out into its own component that will solely just format recipes. And the way we do that is create the interface for formatting the recipe. So again, I've just created this one, but you can see we know what it needs to do because it's just this. Okay, and then we'll create a concrete implementation of that interface. And here, this is now going to be our, let's call it the HTML recipe formatter, because this is a particular implementation that outputs as HTML. And this will implement iRecipe formatter, that's right. Let's implement that interface. And again, we've got the code we need because it's all here, so I'll just pull that out of the service and put that in here. Okay, good stuff, looks good. Once again, we now don't need this really. And we'll create the constructor. And now we we pass in the formatter. So here it is. I'll create the read-only field once more. And there's our instance, and now we can replace that piece of code with formatter.format recipe. Yes, that works, good. So again, we're passing in the recipe formatter. We don't have a concrete implementation of it. And here, this means that if we want to, for example, format the output as JSON or some other format, then we don't need to modify this service. We simply pass in a different formatter. We could create another formatter up here instead of the HTML one, make sure it implements iRecipe formatter, and then pass that into the service. The final piece of the puzzle is to pass in the database rather than creating an instance of it inside the service. Now, to speed things up here, I've already created the iRecipe database interface, which returns all the recipes, and the recipe database object that we're already using already implements that interface. So all we need to do now is go back to the service, and as well as the formatter, we need to pass in the database. So iRecipe database, you know how it goes. And what can we get rid of now? Well, we can, probably the easiest way to do it will be to return database get recipes. I think that pretty much does it. We could probably tidy up further, but I think that's okay. What have we achieved there? Well, we've now got a controller that does very little other than serve up the functionality over HTTP. We've got a recipe service that does very little other than use a formatter and a database to return results. And then we've got the HTML recipe formatter that deals simply with formatting in HTML, and the database which simply pulls in the data from the underlying database. So we've resolved all of those issues that I spoke about in the beginning. We now have a controller that we can test in isolation. We have a recipe service that we can test in isolation, because we can pass in anything we want as long as it implements these interfaces. And of course that means we can mock them out. Now I plan to do a further video on mocking, which will show you how to unit test these components that we've created and how easy it becomes now that we're injecting the dependencies. The other video that I intend to do is how these dependencies can be resolved. So as it stands here, we can obviously create instance of the controller of the service and so on simply by initializing new formatters and databases and so on in the calling code. We're still injecting those dependencies, that's okay. But there are cleverer methods of resolving those dependencies so that, again, you don't have to create instances anywhere in your code. They will just be resolved. So I'll hopefully do a video on that. I hope that you found that a useful introduction. If so, please subscribe and put something in the comments. Let me know what else you'd like to see. If there's anything you need further explanation on, or you'd like me to go into a bit more detail in anything related, then just let me know. And hopefully we'll speak again soon.